Okay, so imagine it's the year 1850 and you've got a sore throat. Congratulations! The doctor's plan is to drain half your blood, hammer an ice pick through your eyeball, and blow tobacco smoke straight up your butt to balance you out. And somehow, you were supposed to thank him for it. Yeah. America's medical history is basically a horror movie where the villain has a diploma. I dug up 111 of the most disturbing, no anesthesia. Wait, that's illegal now. Facts from our past. And I promise at least 10 of these are going to make you gasp out loud and text your group chat. So smash that like button before a 1800s doctor smashes your kneecap with a saw, drop a comment with the fact that wrecked you the most, and subscribe so your descendants don't forget how good they've got it. Now let's get into it. 1. Dr. Walter Freeman thought madness could be fixed with a tool from the garage. This man literally grabbed an ice pick, hammered it through a patient's eye socket, and wiggled it around in their brain like he was scrambling eggs. The whole thing took under 10 minutes and he called it surgery. He even did them in his van, which he proudly nicknamed the Lobotomobile. Patients walked in troubled and walked out blank. America somehow let this guy keep going. 2. For 40 years, the United States government watched a disease destroy hundreds of black men and did nothing on purpose. These men in Tuskegee, Alabama, thought they were getting free healthcare. Instead, doctors sat back with clipboards, tracking how syphilis slowly wrecked their bodies. Penicillin existed, and a cure was sitting right there, but the doctors hid it because they wanted to see the ending. The men trusted them completely, never knowing they were lab rats in their own country. 3. This man got rich shoving goat parts into people, and somehow nobody stopped him. The Radium Girls were young women hired to paint glowing numbers on watch dials, and they were taught to lick their brushes to a sharp point. So they swallowed radium all day long, glowing in the dark on their walk home like little ghosts. They thought it was magical. Then their jaws started rotting and crumbling, their bones literally disintegrating from the inside while they kept showing up to work. 4. The father of modern gynecology built his fame on horror. Dr. J. Marion Sims performed brutal experimental surgeries on enslaved black women without a drop of anesthesia because he believed they did not feel pain the same way. One woman named Anarcha was cut open around 30 separate times while fully awake. He kept perfecting his technique on her body like she was a practice dummy. Today, his statues kept getting torn down, and honestly, Americans were right to want them gone for good. 5. The most powerful man in America was killed by his own doctors trying to help him. George Washington woke up one morning with a nasty sore throat. His doctors decided the obvious cure was to drain out an enormous amount of his blood, over and over, until he had almost none left. Washington basically watched himself get weaker by the hour. He was the guy who survived an entire war, and a scratchy throat plus 3 confident doctors finished him off within a single day. 6. Someone looked at a drowning victim and thought the cure was smoke up the rear. The tobacco smoke enema was a genuine medical standard, where rescuers used a bellows to literally blow tobacco smoke into a person's backside, hoping it would wake them up. Doctors swore it warmed the body and restarted breathing. Crowds would gather while a serious professional puffed smoke into someone's behind on a riverbank. The phrase blowing smoke up somebody actually comes from this, which makes every conversation funnier now. 7. A man with no real medical training became a millionaire selling goat testicles to desperate husbands. Dr. John Brinkley promised that surgically transplanting goat glands into men would cure impotence and bring back their youthful spark. Men lined up and paid huge money to get barnyard parts sewn inside them. Brinkley got rich, built a giant radio station to advertise himself, and almost became governor of Kansas. Meanwhile, his patients walked around with goat tissue rotting inside them, wondering why they felt worse than before. 8. A president survived a bullet only to be slowly killed by filthy fingers. When President James Garfield was shot in 1881, the wound itself was not the problem. His doctors kept digging around inside him with unwashed hands and dirty instruments, hunting for the bullet like they were searching couch cushions. Infection spread everywhere they touched. Garfield rotted from the inside for 80 agonizing days. The shooter later argued he only fired the gun, and the doctors actually did the murdering, which was disturbingly accurate. 9. The government injected people with one of the deadliest substances on Earth just to take notes. During the Manhattan Project, Doctors secretly injected unsuspecting hospital patients with plutonium, the same stuff inside atomic bombs. These folks thought they were getting normal treatment. Instead, scientists were tracking how the radioactive poison traveled through living human bodies, treating sick Americans like test tubes with legs. Nobody asked permission and nobody explained. The patients went about their lives carrying glowing death inside their bones for science nobody told them about. 10. Parents once fried their children's feet with radiation just to buy shoes. American shoe stores proudly installed X-ray machines so kids could stick their feet inside and watch their own bones wiggle on a glowing screen. It was a sales gimmick, pure entertainment, and children begged to do it again and again. Nobody knew they were blasting growing feet with radiation for fun. Salesmen stood right beside the machine all day, soaking up far more, slowly cooking themselves while ringing up another happy family. 11. Back in the day, the greatest surgeon in America was just the fastest one with a knife. Before anesthesia existed in 1846, speed was everything, because the patient was wide awake and screaming the entire time. A skilled doctor could saw a whole leg off in under a minute, racing the clock before the shock killed his patient. Crowds timed them like a sport. The surgeon's bragging right was not skill or cleanliness, it was simply how fast he could remove a limb. 12. The Civil War surgeons amputated so many limbs that the leftovers stacked up like firewood. Outside the hospital tents, severed arms and legs piled into grim mountains, sometimes taller than the men working there. Soldiers waiting their turn could see the heap growing and knew exactly what was coming. The surgeons worked non-stop, tossing each fresh limb onto the pile without a second glance. Some pits got so full that locals complained about the smell drifting for miles across the countryside. 13. A poor woman in 1951 unknowingly became the most important person in modern medicine. Henrietta Lacks went to the hospital for cancer treatment, and doctors quietly snipped a sample of her cells without ever asking her. Those cells turned out to be immortal, multiplying forever in labs around the world. They helped build vaccines and cures worth billions. Meanwhile, Henrietta died broke, and her family had no idea for decades that pieces of her were being shipped and sold across the planet. 14. People once paid actual money to laugh at mentally ill patients like it was a theme park. Asylums opened their doors to paying visitors who strolled the halls gawking at suffering humans locked in cages. Families packed picnics and made a whole afternoon of it, poking at patients and giggling at their distress. The institutions cashed in, treating their own residents like zoo exhibits. It was considered wholesome weekend entertainment, which tells you everything about how little anyone cared back then. 15. Mothers were quietly drugging their babies into silence without knowing it. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was the best-selling fix for teething infants, and it worked like magic because it was absolutely loaded with morphine. Cranky babies went silent and still almost instantly, and grateful parents bought it by the bottle. The problem was that an unknown number of those babies never woke back up. The label said nothing, the ads called it harmless, and trusting mothers spooned it out daily. 16. Doctors once believed the sicker they made you, the better the treatment was working. Tartar emetic was a popular medicine designed to force violent, relentless vomiting for hours on end. The patient would be heaving and miserable, and the doctor would nod proudly, convinced he was driving the disease right out the body. The more wretched you looked, the more confident he became. People paid for this. Imagine going to a professional, getting poisoned on purpose, and being told, "Congratulations, it is working." 17. There was a job in America that involved digging up fresh graves at night for cash. Medical schools were so desperate for bodies to dissect that a whole shadow profession appeared, the resurrection men. These grave robbers crept into cemeteries after dark, dug up the recently buried, and hauled the corpses off to sell to anatomy professors. Nobody asked questions. Families started guarding graves with shovels, terrified their loved ones would vanish before the dirt even settled. Business was disturbingly good. 18. Doctors were accidentally killing new mothers because washing hands was not a thing yet. Physicians would spend the morning elbow-deep in rotting corpses during dissections, then walk straight over to deliver babies without rinsing so much as a finger. They carried death from one room to the next. Countless mothers caught childbed fever and died days after giving birth, and nobody connected the dots. When one doctor finally suggested washing up, his colleagues got offended and mostly ignored him completely. 19. One healthy cook accidentally became America's most famous walking outbreak. Mary Mallon, forever known as Typhoid Mary, felt perfectly fine while silently spreading typhoid to dozens of people through the meals she cooked. She refused to believe she was dangerous, since she never felt sick a day in her life. Wherever she worked, people fell ill. Officials finally locked her away on a New York island for nearly 30 years, where she insisted the whole time she had done nothing wrong. 20. Americans once wrapped their children in literal cancer and called it cozy. Asbestos was marketed as a miracle material, woven right into kids' clothing and oven mitts, even sprinkled around as fake snow on movie sets and Christmas trees. Families gleefully tossed the fluffy white poison around the living room every December. Actors breathed it in during famous holiday films. It was everywhere, advertised as clean and modern, while quietly scarring lungs and seeding deadly disease in everyone who admired the pretty flakes. 21. The greatest escape artist alive could not escape his own ego. Harry Houdini bragged that he could take any punch to the gut, so a college student decided to test it. The kid slugged him hard before Houdini could even brace his muscles. Houdini laughed it off and kept performing, but his appendix had already ruptured inside him. Days later, the man who escaped chains, tanks, and locked boxes died from a punch he basically dared a stranger to throw at him. 22. Before painkillers existed, getting a rotten tooth pulled was pure medieval nightmare. There was no dentist, just a traveling tooth drawer who would brace your head against his chest, grip the bad tooth with iron pliers, and rip it straight out of your skull. No numbing, no warning, just brute strength and a sickening crack. People would scream loud enough to draw a crowd. Some tooth drawers worked at fairs, yanking teeth as entertainment, while onlookers winced and cheered them on. 23. A small-town doctor cut a giant tumor out of a fully awake woman who calmed herself with scripture. In 1809 Kentucky, Ephraim McDowell attempted a surgery everyone thought was impossible, removing a 22-pound tumor from his patient. With no anesthesia, she lay on the table reciting psalms out loud to survive the agony. McDowell sliced and worked while she prayed through every cut. Miraculously, she lived, walked away healed, and he pulled off one of the boldest operations in early American history. 24. The battlefield hospital was often just a barn with a door for an operating table. Field surgeons had no clean rooms, no proper equipment, nothing fancy at all. They would yank a door off its hinges, lay it across two barrels, and call it Surgery Central. Wounded soldiers were dropped onto that splintered wood while the doctor went to work. Flies buzzed, blood soaked into the planks, and the next patient waited right behind. It was as primitive as medicine could possibly get. 25. To prove a disease was not contagious, one doctor and his team ate the nastiest thing imaginable. Dr. Goldberger believed pellagra came from poor diet, not germs, and the public refused to believe him. So he and his volunteers swallowed capsules made from sick patients' scabs, snot, and other bodily fluids, basically a disgusting human smoothie. Nobody got pellagra from it, which proved his point perfectly. He gagged down filth to win an argument, and disturbingly enough, it actually worked. 26. One determined woman exposed that America was caging the mentally ill like criminals. Dorothea Dix traveled the country and was horrified to find sick, vulnerable people locked in freezing, unheated cells right alongside violent prisoners. They sat chained in their own filth, forgotten and shivering. Dix gathered the evidence and marched it straight to lawmakers, refusing to be ignored. Her reports shocked the nation and forced real change. She turned quiet outrage into a one-woman crusade that genuinely saved lives. 27. America's most beloved soft drink used to come with a literal kick of cocaine. Early Coca-Cola genuinely contained cocaine, sold proudly as a refreshing tonic for tired, nervous folks who needed a little pep. People sipped it at the pharmacy counter to feel energized and bright. Naturally, everyone loved it and could not figure out why they kept coming back for more. Eventually, the company quietly removed the cocaine. But for years, Americans were getting buzzed off the real thing without blinking. 28. People once treated turpentine, the stuff you clean paintbrushes with, as cold medicine. Well into modern times, Americans swallowed spoonfuls of turpentine to fight off worms, coughs, and stubborn colds. Grandmothers swore by it and dosed entire families without hesitation. The same chemical sitting in the paint shed was going down throats as a trusted home remedy. People insisted it cleared them right up, ignoring the fact that they were basically drinking a flammable solvent and hoping for the best every time. 29. A mob in 1788 New York rioted over stolen corpses, and people actually died. The doctors' riot erupted when furious New Yorkers discovered medical students cutting up bodies that had been robbed from local graves. Word spread fast, and a massive crowd stormed the building, enraged that their dead relatives were being sliced apart for practice. The chaos turned deadly as soldiers were called in, and several people lost their lives. It was one of the strangest, bloodiest riots in early American history. 30. At some American foundling homes, nearly every single abandoned baby died. These places were supposed to rescue unwanted infants, but the conditions were so neglectful that death rates climbed toward a horrifying 100%. Babies were left without enough milk, warmth, or human touch, slowly fading in their cribs. The staff barely intervened. Society dropped these children off thinking they would be safe and cared for, when in reality the homes were quiet places where the helpless simply did not survive. 31. The 1918 flu killed so many Americans that whole cities ran out of coffins. An estimated 675,000 people died, and the dead piled up faster than anyone could bury them. Gravediggers got sick or simply could not keep pace, so bodies waited in homes and hallways for days. Families built their own caskets out of scrap wood. Some towns dug mass trenches just to keep up. The living were exhausted, terrified, and surrounded by death at every single turn. 32. Milk sellers were quietly poisoning babies to keep their product looking fresh. Before the 1906 Pure Food Law, dairymen mixed formaldehyde, the same stuff used to preserve corpses, right into the milk so it would not spoil on the shelf. Parents bought it, trusting it was wholesome and nourishing. Instead, infants got sick, and many died from drinking embalming fluid disguised as breakfast. Nobody regulated it, nobody warned anyone, and grocers happily sold poisoned milk to families who never suspected a thing. 33. A sitting president had secret surgery on a moving boat to fool the entire country. In 1893, Grover Cleveland discovered a tumor in his jaw, but with the economy panicking, he refused to look weak. So he boarded a yacht, sailed out onto the water, and let doctors cut the tumor out of his mouth in secret while the boat cruised along. The press was told he was just vacationing. He returned with a rubber jaw and a straight face, fooling everyone perfectly. 34. Your fancy dentures used to be built from the teeth of dead soldiers. After major battles, scavengers crept across the corpse-strewn fields, yanking healthy teeth out of fallen young men. These teeth were cleaned, sorted, and sold by the barrel to dentists. Wealthy customers proudly chewed their dinners using the mouths of the war dead. People knew exactly where the teeth came from and wore them anyway. Nothing said high society quite like smiling with a stranger's teeth pulled fresh off a battlefield. 35. At the first public surgery using ether, the surgeon basically told the crowd this is not a scam. In 1846 Boston, doctors gathered to watch a patient breathe in ether and then sleep peacefully through an operation that should have been screaming agony. The surgeon worked, the patient stayed calm, and the stunned onlookers could hardly believe their eyes. He turned to the skeptical room and announced, "This is no humbug." That single moment changed surgery forever and finally killed the era of pain. 36. Surgeons used the exact same blade on patient after patient without ever cleaning it. The scalpel and bone saw would slice through one man, then get wiped on a filthy blood-crusted apron before moving straight to the next. No soap, no water, no thought at all. Infection rode happily from body to body on that dirty steel. Doctors saw the crust of old gore as totally normal. The instrument that was supposed to heal you was basically a relay baton for deadly germs. 37. Researchers in 1939 tortured orphans with words just to see if they could break them. The experiment was so cruel it became known as the monster study. Scientists took normal-speaking orphaned children and relentlessly badgered, criticized, and shamed them about their speech. The constant psychological abuse worked, and some of those kids developed stutters that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The researchers ruined real children to test a theory, then quietly buried the results, hoping nobody would ever find out. 38. One doctor was convinced insanity hid inside your body parts, so he just started removing them. Dr. Henry Cotton believed mental illness came from secret infections lurking in the teeth and organs. His brilliant cure was to yank out patients' teeth, then their tonsils, then their stomachs and other organs, hunting for the imaginary source. Many patients died on his table from the surgeries themselves. He kept operating, fully confident, while bodies stacked up. He was curing madness by carving people into pieces. 39. Heroin was once sold to children as a friendly little cough syrup. Pharmacies stocked it right on the shelf, advertised as completely safe, gentle, and non-addictive, perfect for soothing a child's nasty cough. Parents dosed their little ones without a flicker of worry. The medicine worked beautifully because, well, it was heroin. Families had no idea they were hooking their kids on one of the most addictive drugs ever made. The label promised wholesome relief while quietly building a generation of tiny addicts. 40. Abraham Lincoln was likely poisoning himself with mercury pills and getting furious because of it. For years, Lincoln swallowed blue mass pills loaded with mercury to treat his low moods. The problem is mercury slowly wrecks the brain, and people noticed Lincoln flying into strange rages and trembling fits. Once he stopped taking the pills, his famous calm and steady temperament returned. The legendary patience we remember almost did not exist because the medicine meant to fix him was quietly rotting his mind. 41. A medical college bought an enslaved man for the specific job of robbing graves. Grandison Harris was purchased by a Georgia medical school not to work the fields, but to sneak into cemeteries at night and dig up fresh corpses for students to dissect. He became so skilled that the school depended on him completely. He hauled bodies, prepped them, and kept the program running for decades. They literally enslaved a man to supply the dead, then later buried those same bones in the building's basement. 42. Twilight sleep promised painless childbirth, but turned delivery into a nightmare nobody remembered. Doctors gave laboring women a drug cocktail that erased their memory of the whole experience, which sounded wonderful on paper. In reality, the women stayed wide awake and in agony, thrashing so violently they had to be strapped down and restrained for hours. They screamed and fought through the pain and simply forgot it all afterward. So the suffering still happened, every brutal second of it, just with no one left to recall it. 43. An enslaved African man taught America how to beat smallpox, and barely anyone thanked him. Onesimus explained to Cotton Mather a technique from his homeland, deliberately infecting healthy people with a tiny bit of smallpox so their bodies could fight it off and become immune. The idea sounded insane to colonists, but it actually worked and saved countless lives during outbreaks. The breakthrough that protected America came straight from the knowledge of an enslaved man who got almost no credit for handing over a miracle. 44. A medicine sweetened with antifreeze poisoned over 100 people, many of them children. In 1937, a company sold a liquid drug called elixir sulfanilamide, and to make it taste pleasant, they mixed it with the same toxic chemical found in antifreeze. Parents gave it to sick kids expecting them to get better. Instead, more than 100 people died agonizing deaths from the poison. There was no testing required back then, so the company never checked. The tragedy finally forced America to demand drug safety laws. 45. A man took a 3-foot iron rod straight through his skull and somehow stood right back up. In 1848, Phineas Gage was packing explosives when a blast fired a long iron rod clean through his head and out the top. Incredibly, he survived, talked, and walked away from it. But the friendly, reliable man everyone knew was gone, replaced by someone rude, reckless, and impulsive. His personality flipped completely. Doctors were stunned, and his shattered skull became one of the most famous lessons in all of brain science. 46. One dentist turned pulling teeth into a full circus act to hide the screaming. Painless Parker ran his practice like a carnival, yanking teeth on a stage in front of crowds while a loud brass band blasted music beside him. The noise was not for fun. It was to drown out the patient's agonized screams so the audience would stay relaxed. He pulled thousands of teeth this way, smiling through the chaos. People paid to watch, never quite realizing the band was basically a screaming cover-up. 47. With no way to dull pain, surgery required a team of strong men whose only job was pinning you down. The patient was wide awake and would absolutely try to flee the moment the knife touched them, so burly assistants strapped them to the table and held every limb. Their entire purpose was to stop the screaming patient from bolting mid-operation. The surgeon sliced, while the human anchors clamped down hard. It was less like medicine and more like a wrestling match with a knife involved. 48. The bullets in the Civil War were designed in a way that basically guaranteed you would lose a limb. The Minié ball was a slow, heavy chunk of lead that did not pass cleanly through a body. Instead, it flattened and shattered bones into splinters that could never heal right. Once that happened, the surgeon had only one real option, and that was to saw the arm or leg off entirely. The weapon's design alone is why those amputation piles outside the tents grew so enormous. 49. Disabled children were deliberately fed a virus so researchers could study how it spread. At the Willowbrook Institution, scientists intentionally gave hepatitis to the very kids they were supposed to be protecting. They wanted to track the disease, so they used helpless residents as living test subjects. Parents were sometimes pressured into agreeing just to get their children admitted at all. The place was already a nightmare of neglect, and on top of that, the staff were feeding sickness to children on purpose for data. 50. A fearless reporter faked being insane to expose the horrors inside an asylum. In 1887, Nellie Bly pretended to lose her mind, got herself committed, and spent 10 days trapped inside a women's mental institution. What she found was brutal, as patients were beaten, starved, and dunked into freezing baths by the staff. When she got out, she published every shocking detail, and the public exploded with outrage. Her undercover stunt forced real reform and proved one brave woman could blow the whole thing wide open. 51. People once paid good money to swallow a live worm so it could eat their food for them. Tapeworm diet pills were advertised as the effortless way to lose weight, promising you could keep stuffing your face while the worm inside your gut handled the calories. Dieters happily ingested live parasites, picturing a slim figure with zero willpower required. The worm grew fat and long inside them while they bragged about the easy results. It was disgusting, dangerous, and somehow a genuine fashion trend in America. 52. Frontier families believed a magic rock could literally suck rabies out of a bite. The Madstone was a special pebble that people pressed against animal bites, convinced it would draw out the deadly poison like a sponge. These stones were so prized that families traveled for miles to borrow one from a neighbor who owned the lucky rock. They would hold it to the wound for hours, praying it worked. Of course, it did nothing, but the faith in that little rock was absolute. 53. Stolen corpses were shipped across America disguised as ordinary cargo so nobody asked questions. Grave robbers packed freshly dug bodies into barrels and crates, slapped on labels reading regular goods, and sent them off to anatomy schools by the wagon load. Dock workers and drivers handled the heavy containers, never knowing a dead neighbor was sloshing around inside. The whole gruesome supply chain ran in plain sight. As long as the box looked boring and the paperwork looked normal, a body could travel the country unnoticed. 54. Having a C-section used to be basically a death sentence written for the mother. Before modern surgery, doctors only attempted the operation when the woman was already dying, because cutting her open almost always killed her too. There was no real way to stop the bleeding or fight the infection that followed. So the procedure was a last desperate act, a final gamble to maybe save the baby. Mothers dreaded it, knowing the surgery meant to deliver life usually ended their own in the process. 55. When the plague hit San Francisco, officials chose protecting business over saving lives. During the early 1900s bubonic plague outbreak, city leaders flat out denied it was happening, terrified that the truth would scare away trade and tourists. So they covered it up, hid the deaths, and let the disease quietly spread while pretending everything was fine. People kept getting sick and dying as the officials smiled and reassured everyone. By the time they admitted the truth, the lie had already cost a lot of lives. 56. An Olympic marathon was won by a runner who got dosed with rat poison mid-race. Strychnine, the same stuff used to kill rats, was actually sold in tonics as an energy booster, and the 1904 marathon winner got fed it on the course. His handlers also gave him brandy, basically running him on poison and booze. He staggered across the finish line barely conscious, nearly dying for the gold. Today, that would end a career, but back then, it was considered a clever performance edge. 57. A president's daughter endured a breast removal surgery while strapped to a chair, fully awake. Nabby Adams, daughter of John Adams, was diagnosed with breast cancer in an age with no anesthesia whatsoever. To treat it, doctors tied her to a chair and cut the cancer out while she sat there conscious through every horrifying second. She gritted through unimaginable pain with nothing but raw willpower. The surgery was supposed to save her, but the cancer returned anyway, making the whole ordeal even more heartbreaking. 58. Rich people once had poor folks' teeth ripped out and screwed into their own mouths. The wealthy wanted perfect smiles, so they paid desperate poor donors to surrender their healthy teeth, which were then transplanted straight into the rich customer's gums. The donor walked away with cash and a gap, and the buyer walked away with a stranger's tooth. The catch was that these transplants almost always rotted and fell out within months, so they spent fortunes for borrowed teeth that betrayed them fast. 59. Surgeons proudly wore the same blood-soaked coat for years like a badge of honor. The more crusted and stiff with old gore the coat became, the more respected the surgeon because that filth supposedly proved how much experience he had. They never washed it. They walked from patient to patient draped in layers of dried blood from people who came before. To them it was a resume you could wear. To everyone now, it is obviously a walking biohazard spreading infection with every step. 60. After battles, special embalmers chased the armies hoping to cash in on grieving families. These embalming surgeons set up shop near the fighting and charged heartbroken relatives steep fees to preserve and ship dead soldiers' bodies back home. They knew families were desperate to bury their boys properly, so they jacked up the prices and profited off the grief. Business boomed wherever the fighting was thickest. They turned mourning into a money machine, following the trail of death like merchants chasing a guaranteed sale. 61. The CIA secretly drugged unsuspecting Americans with LSD just to learn how to control their minds. The program was called MK Ultra, and agents slipped the powerful hallucinogen to ordinary people who had no clue they were being experimented on. Citizens suddenly tripped out of their minds, terrified and confused, with no idea why reality was melting around them. The government wanted mind control techniques and treated regular folks as disposable guinea pigs. Some never fully recovered, and for years nobody even knew the program existed. 62. A founding father thought the cure for madness was strapping people into a chair so they could not move. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, invented something he called the tranquilizer chair to calm the mentally ill. His brilliant idea was total immobilization, binding patients so tightly they could barely twitch a finger. He believed restricting all movement would soothe a troubled mind. Instead, it just trapped suffering people in place for hours. A great patriot, sure, but his therapy was basically a fancy torture device. 63. Fashionable women once ate actual poison to get a trendy, pale complexion. Arsenic wafers were sold as beauty supplements, and ladies swallowed them daily, chasing that delicate, ghostly glow everyone admired. The poison did make their skin paler, mostly by slowly wrecking their bodies from the inside. They smiled at their reflection while arsenic crept through their veins. Beauty standards demanded a corpse-like pallor, and these women were happy to oblige, literally poisoning themselves one little wafer at a time for the sake of looking fashionable. 64. Doctors used to slice wounds into people and keep them oozing on purpose for months. The treatment was called a seton, and the theory was that draining pus carried disease out of the body. So physicians cut open a healthy patch of skin and jammed materials inside to stop it from healing, keeping the wound leaking endlessly. Patients walked around with deliberate festering holes, told this was good for them. It was the opposite of healing, an open invitation for infection, all based on completely backwards logic. 65. Families got so scared of grave robbers that they rigged coffins to explode. Body thieves were stealing the dead so often that desperate relatives fought back with iron cages called mort safes locked over graves. Some even buried the coffins wired with gunpowder torpedoes, so any robber digging in for a fresh corpse might get blown sky high. People literally booby-trapped their loved ones' resting places. Guarding the dead became a serious nighttime chore, complete with weapons, traps, and the very real chance of a graveyard explosion. 66. Almost any female complaint imaginable got dumped into one nonsense diagnosis called hysteria. Feeling tired, anxious, irritable, or simply having opinions could all get a woman labeled hysterical by her doctor. The shockingly common treatment involved a physician performing a pelvic massage until the patient felt relief. Doctors did this with totally straight faces, billing it as serious medicine. It was a catch-all excuse to dismiss women entirely, wrapping centuries of ignoring female health into one vague word and one extremely awkward therapy session. 67. People who could not breathe were sealed inside giant metal tanks, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Polio could paralyze the muscles needed to breathe, so doctors placed patients inside huge machines called iron lungs that did the breathing for them. Only the person's head stuck out while the rest stayed trapped in the metal cylinder. Some lived inside these tanks for years, even decades, eating, sleeping, and watching the world through a little mirror. They survived, but their entire existence shrank down to a tube. 68. A deadly poison was casually sold to women as a cream to remove unwanted hair. Thallium was marketed as a smooth beauty product. And yes, it did make hair fall out because it is wildly toxic. The same poison used to kill rodents was rubbed onto skin in the name of grooming. Women lost the hair they wanted gone, then lost the hair they wanted to keep, then suffered nerve damage and worse. Some died. The hair removal worked perfectly, mostly because it was slowly killing them. 69. A doctor studied human digestion by literally watching food churn through a hole in a man's stomach. After a fur trapper survived a gunshot, his wound never fully closed, leaving a permanent window straight into his stomach. Dr. William Beaumont saw an opportunity and started peering inside, dangling bits of food on strings to watch them digest. The trapper basically became a living science experiment with a porthole in his gut. Beaumont made huge discoveries about digestion, all by gazing through a hole that should have killed the man. 70. Early dentists drilled directly into live nerves using a drill powered by their own foot. There was nothing to numb the pain, so patients felt every grinding rotation as the dentist pumped a pedal like an old sewing machine. The slow drill chewed into the raw nerve while the patient gripped the chair, sweating and shaking. Each cavity was an exercise in pure endurance. The whole setup looked more like a workshop tool than medicine, and honestly, it functioned about as gently as one too. 71. Operating rooms spread sawdust on the floor just to soak up all the blood. Surgeons worked so messily with no anesthesia and no cleanliness that puddles of blood would pool around the table during every operation. So they scattered sawdust like a butcher shop to mop it up and kept a wooden tub nearby specifically to catch amputated arms and legs as they were sawed off. The setup treated human surgery exactly like carving meat. Patients lay on that floor knowing the tub was waiting. 72. Way more soldiers were killed by their own bathroom problems than by enemy bullets. During the wars, disease was the real killer, as dysentery, typhoid, and infections swept through the filthy camps and dropped men by the thousands. Soldiers who survived fierce battles still died days later from drinking dirty water or living in their own waste. The enemy barely needed to fire a shot. Sickness did the heavy lifting, quietly wiping out far more troops than any heroic charge or cannon blast ever managed. 73. A school fed radioactive oatmeal to little boys at breakfast and called it a nutrition study. At a Massachusetts state institution, researchers mixed radioactive material right into the morning oatmeal of unsuspecting children. The boys ate their cereal thinking it was a normal meal, never knowing scientists were tracking radiation moving through their bodies. They were lured in with a special club and treats. The whole thing was disguised as helping them grow strong, when really they were being quietly turned into glowing little test subjects. 74. Doctors deliberately threw mentally ill patients into comas using massive overdoses of insulin. The treatment was called insulin shock therapy, and the idea was to flood the patient with so much insulin that their blood sugar crashed and they slipped into unconsciousness. Then they did it again and again, day after day for weeks. Patients sweated, convulsed, and sometimes never woke up. Doctors swore the repeated comas reset the mind somehow. Really, it was a terrifying gamble where the cure was just barely surviving over and over. 75. A traveling salesman killed a rattlesnake on stage to sell a medicine that contained zero snake. Clark Stanley billed himself as the Rattlesnake King. Slaughtering a live snake in front of gasping crowds to prove his miracle liniment was the real deal. People bought thousands of bottles, convinced the snake oil would cure their aches. Years later, testing revealed his product had no snake in it at all, just mineral oil and filler. He invented the entire idea of snake oil being a worthless scam. 76. Doctors treated sickness by intentionally burning huge painful blisters onto a patient's skin. The practice was called blistering, and physicians would apply scalding chemicals or hot objects to raise enormous bubbles on purpose, believing the blisters drew the illness out of the body. The patient sat there in agony, skin bubbling and weeping, while the doctor nodded with satisfaction. The bigger the blister, the better the supposed cure. So, on top of being sick, you also got deliberately scorched, all in the name of feeling better. 77. By law, executed criminals got their bodies cut apart afterward, as a punishment worse than death itself. Society believed dissection was so shameful and horrifying that it made a perfect extra penalty, so the corpses of the hanged were handed straight to anatomists. The condemned often feared the slicing table more than the noose. They wanted a proper burial and a peaceful afterlife, and the law denied them even that. Getting executed was only half the sentence, with the scalpel waiting to finish the job. 78. The famous rest cure locked women in bed for weeks with absolutely nothing to do. No reading, no work, no visitors, no conversation, just lying in a quiet room staring at the ceiling for as long as the doctor demanded. It was supposed to calm anxious or depressed women, but the crushing boredom and isolation often pushed them toward a genuine breakdown instead. The treatment for a struggling mind was to take away everything that kept it alive. Some emerged far worse than they went in. 79. People genuinely believed bad air caused disease, so they fired cannons in the streets to fight it. During outbreaks, towns blasted gunpowder, set fires, and burned tar everywhere, convinced the smoke and noise would purify the dangerous air spreading the sickness. Crowds gathered to watch their neighbors shoot cannons at an invisible enemy floating in the breeze. The real culprits, germs and filth, sat untouched while everyone choked on smoke. It was a loud, dramatic, completely useless war waged against thin air and bad smells. 80. Workers making leaded gasoline literally went insane and dropped dead, yet America kept pumping the stuff anyway. At the factories producing this fuel, men suffered violent hallucinations, lost their minds, and died from lead poisoning, earning the product the grim nickname loony gas. Despite workers collapsing and convulsing, the industry shrugged and insisted it was perfectly safe. They kept selling it for decades, poisoning the air millions breathed. The warning signs were dropping dead right in front of them, and nobody wanted to stop the money. 81. A pair of conjoined twins settled down in North Carolina, married 2 sisters, and had 21 kids between them. Chong and Eng Bunker were physically joined at the chest their entire lives, yet they built a remarkably full American life on a farm. They each married a different sister and somehow raised an enormous combined family of 21 children. The brothers worked out a careful schedule splitting time between 2 households. They turned an impossible situation into a sprawling family tree that still has descendants today. 82. Millions of perfectly healthy kids got their tonsils ripped out for basically no reason at all. Doctors decided tonsils were trouble waiting to happen, so they yanked them from children everywhere to prevent illness, even when nothing was wrong. There was almost no evidence it helped, but the surgery became wildly fashionable anyway. Whole classrooms of kids lost their tonsils like it was a rite of passage. Parents lined up trusting the experts, never questioning why a healthy child needed body parts removed just in case. 83. Cutting a stone out of a conscious patient's bladder was considered the most agonizing operation a human could possibly survive. With no anesthesia, The surgeon had to slice into one of the most sensitive areas of the body while the patient screamed and writhed. Strong men pinned the victim down as the doctor dug for the stone as fast as humanly possible. The pain was so legendary that people delayed it for years, suffering with the stone rather than facing the knife. Survivors never forgot a single second. 84. Wriggling maggots turned out to be better at cleaning wounds than the actual surgeons were. During the wars, doctors noticed that injuries crawling with maggots somehow healed cleaner than the ones without. The little grubs ate only the dead, rotting flesh and left the healthy tissue completely alone, scrubbing out infection like tiny, tireless janitors. What seemed like a horrifying sign of neglect was secretly saving lives. Eventually, medicine embraced the squirming helpers on purpose, proving that sometimes the grossest thing in the room is the hero. 85. Prisoners had dangerous chemicals and infectious diseases tested on their skin for decades inside an American jail. At Holmesburg Prison, inmates were used as cheap test subjects, with researchers smearing dioxin, viruses, and harsh experimental compounds onto their bodies. The prisoners signed up for small amounts of money, often not understanding the real risks. Their skin blistered, scarred, and reacted to substances nobody should ever touch. For years, the prison ran like a human laboratory, treating captive men as disposable patches of skin available for rent. 86. To cure insanity, doctors decided to deliberately infect patients with malaria and let the raging fevers cook the illness out. The theory was that the intense body-racking fevers from malaria would somehow burn away mental illness. So physicians injected sick patients with the disease on purpose, then watched them shake and sweat through dangerous fevers. Astonishingly, it sometimes helped certain conditions, which earned the inventor a Nobel Prize. Still, the basic plan was giving one terrible disease to fight another: gambling. The patient survived the cure. 87. A wildly popular women's health tonic was secretly stronger than most wine in your cabinet. Lydia Pinkham's famous vegetable compound was marketed to women for all their aches and troubles, and it worked wonders mainly because it was roughly 20% alcohol. Ladies who would never touch liquor happily sipped their medicine and felt absolutely fantastic. They swore by it, refilling constantly, never quite admitting they were essentially drinking. The tonic soothed everything because it was basically getting half the country's women pleasantly buzzed under the label of wellness. 88. For centuries, doctors looked at pus oozing from a wound and decided that was a great sign. They called it laudable pus and genuinely believed it meant the body was healing properly, when in reality, it was deadly infection actively killing the patient. So the more a wound festered and leaked, the more pleased the physician became. They treated the clearest warning of death as cause for celebration. Patients rotted away while their doctors smiled at the goo, convinced everything was going exactly according to plan. 89. When old medical schools got renovated, workers kept stumbling onto wells and basements stuffed with human bones. These were the leftovers from generations of dissections, secretly dumped beneath the buildings instead of being properly buried. Construction crews would crack open a forgotten cellar and find piles of skulls and skeletons staring back at them. The schools had quietly hidden their grim supply of stolen and studied corpses right under their own floors for decades. Nothing ruins a remodel quite like discovering your basement is a mass grave. 90. Doctors removed women's healthy ovaries to fix moodiness and grimly nicknamed it female castration. If a woman seemed irritable, emotional, or difficult, a physician might decide the solution was major surgery to cut out her perfectly fine ovaries. They believed it would calm her temperament and make her agreeable, so women were sliced open and permanently altered, all to treat having normal human feelings. It was painful, dangerous, and based on pure ignorance. They were literally surgically punishing women for moods, then patting themselves on the back. 91. Cholera could kill a perfectly healthy person between breakfast and dinner on the very same day. You could wake up feeling totally fine, then by evening be dead, as the disease drained the body of its fluids at a catastrophic, unstoppable speed. Victims withered before their families' eyes within hours, turning frail and hollow shockingly fast. There was no time to react, no slow decline, just a horrifying sprint toward death. People lived in genuine terror of a sickness that could go from healthy to grave by sundown. 92. A founding father died after shoving a piece of whalebone into himself to clear a blockage. Gouverneur Morris, one of the men who helped shape the Constitution, suffered a urinary blockage and decided to fix it with some seriously gruesome do-it-yourself surgery. He jammed a length of whalebone into his own body, hoping to force the passage open. Instead, he caused fatal damage and died from his own desperate handiwork. A brilliant statesman undone not by enemies or war, but by a terrible plan and a whalebone. 93. Doctors cured certain ailments by pressing a red-hot iron directly onto the raw flesh. The technique was called cauterization, and for problems like hemorrhoids, the treatment meant literally burning the area to seal it shut. The patient was wide awake, smelling their own skin sizzle as the glowing iron did its work. The pain was unimaginable, but doctors swore the searing stopped bleeding and disease. So people endured being branded like cattle in the name of healing, walking away cooked but supposedly cured of their troubles. 94. A surgeon's most terrifying nightmare was a burst artery he had to tie off with his bare hands before the patient bled out in seconds. When a major vessel ruptured on the table, blood would spray and pool instantly, and the doctor had only a moment to grab and knot it shut. One slip, one fumble, and the patient was gone right there in front of everyone. No machines, no backup, just frantic fingers racing against a body emptying itself. It was high-stakes panic with a life on the line. 95. Chloroform was dripped onto a cloth with zero way to measure the dose, so one slip could kill the patient. The method was crude beyond belief, just soaking a rag and holding it over someone's face until they went under. Too little, and they woke up screaming mid-surgery. Too much, and they simply stopped breathing forever. Doctors basically eyeballed a deadly chemical and hoped for the best. People laid down trusting the rag, never knowing if it would put them to sleep or end them permanently. 96. Doctors secretly injected living cancer cells into elderly patients to see if their bodies would fight it off. At a New York hospital, unsuspecting old folks were given shots of active cancer cells without ever being told what was happening. The researchers wanted to study how a body might reject the foreign cancer, and they used vulnerable, trusting patients as their experiment. These people thought they were receiving care. Instead, they were quietly being injected with disease, treated as disposable test subjects by the very doctors meant to protect them. 97. Patients were dunked in ice baths or wrapped tight in freezing wet sheets for hours as routine medical care. The idea was that extreme cold somehow calmed the mind or fixed the body, so doctors regularly submerged people in icy water until they shivered violently. Mental patients especially were strapped into dripping frozen sheets and left there, helpless and numb, sometimes for hours on end. They could not move or escape the cold. It was sold as therapy, but really it was just controlled, shivering misery on repeat. 98. Some anatomists bound their books in actual tanned human skin, and a few of these creepy volumes still survive today. The practice was called anthropodermic bookbinding, and doctors would take the skin from a corpse, tan it like leather, and wrap a book in it. They treated human hide like ordinary bookbinding material, often using the skin of patients or executed criminals. A handful of these grisly books still sit in American collections right now. Somewhere on a shelf, a quiet old book is wearing a person. 99. A baby-saving tool was hidden as one family's secret for over a century while countless mothers and infants died. The forceps, which could safely guide a stuck baby out during a difficult birth, were invented by the Chamberlain family, who guarded the design jealously to protect their profits. They kept it locked away, blindfolding patients so nobody could copy it. For generations, mothers and babies died in deliveries that simple tool could have saved. Greed buried a life-saving invention while families paid the ultimate price for the secret. 100. During outbreaks, entire healthy households were nailed shut inside their homes, trapped with the dying. If one person in a house caught a feared disease, officials would seal the whole family inside and mark the door with a warning sign, locking the well in with the sick. The healthy had no choice but to wait it out alongside the infected, often catching the illness themselves in that sealed tomb of a home. It was meant to stop the spread, but really it just doomed everyone behind the door together. 101. A Civil War general had his shattered leg amputated, then donated the bones to a museum and visited them for years. After a cannonball wrecked General Dan Sickles' leg in battle, doctors sawed it off, and rather than tossing it, he had the bones preserved and shipped to a medical museum. Every year on the anniversary of losing it, Sickles would stroll in and pay a friendly visit to his own amputated leg. He treated the bones like an old war buddy. Honestly, that is a strange way to stay in touch. 102. People genuinely swallowed live frogs, spiders, and fish, believing the creatures would cure them from the inside. The logic was that a wriggling animal sliding down your throat could attack coughs, fevers, or worms while it squirmed around in your guts. So patients gulped down living critters, gagging through the experience and hoping the little passenger would fix them. Of course, it did nothing except traumatize everyone involved. Yet folks kept doing it, fully convinced a frantic frog in the stomach was somehow a legitimate path to good health. 103. Some patients died of pure shock before the surgeon even finished the operation. With no anesthesia, the body could only take so much agony and blood loss before it simply gave out from the overwhelming trauma. Doctors would be midway through an amputation when the patient quietly slipped away, killed not by the wound, but by the sheer horror of feeling every cut. The pain alone could stop a heart. People literally did not survive long enough to be saved, undone by the very treatment meant to rescue them. 104. Hospital gangrene rotted wounds so fast that a man's limb could turn black and putrid within a single day. The infection spread through filthy wards like wildfire, devouring flesh at a terrifying speed and filling the air with an unforgettable stench. A soldier could go to sleep with a treatable injury and wake up with a blackened, dying limb crawling toward death. Surgeons raced to amputate before it climbed higher, but often the rot won. It turned recovery rooms into a grim countdown nobody wanted to be part of. 105. Early electroshock was done with no anesthesia or muscle relaxants, so the convulsions were violent enough to snap bones. Patients were jolted with electricity while fully aware, and their bodies seized so hard that they sometimes fractured their own spines or shattered teeth from clenching. There was nothing to soften the blow or relax the muscles, just raw current slamming through a conscious person. The shaking was so severe it broke them physically. The treatment meant to calm the mind frequently left the body battered and broken instead. 106. A Philadelphia scientist collected a massive pile of human skulls, trying to prove a fake ranking of the races. He gathered hundreds of skulls from around the world and measured them obsessively, convinced the sizes proved some races were superior to others. It was complete junk science, twisted to support the ugly prejudices of his era. He fudged numbers and ignored anything that disagreed with him. Later researchers exposed his work as biased nonsense from start to finish. He built an entire grim collection just to dress up bigotry as research. 107. Women laced themselves into corsets so tight that the garments literally deformed ribs and crushed internal organs. Doctors of the time actually promoted these brutal contraptions as healthy and proper, encouraging women to cinch their waists to fashionable extremes. The pressure squeezed organs out of place, made breathing a struggle, and reshaped skeletons over years of wear. Women fainted regularly from the lack of air. Yet society insisted this slow crushing was good for them, marketing organ damage as elegance and calling agony the price of beauty. 108. To prove how yellow fever spread, doctors let infected mosquitoes bite human volunteers on purpose. The brave and slightly insane test subjects rolled up their sleeves and allowed disease-carrying mosquitoes to feast on them, knowing it might give them a deadly illness. The researchers needed to confirm the bugs were the culprit, so willing volunteers gambled their lives for the answer. Some got dangerously sick, proving the theory right. It was a terrifying experiment, but it cracked the mystery and eventually saved countless lives from a brutal killer. 109. After a duel, Andrew Jackson walked around for years with a bullet lodged near his heart, too risky to remove. A rival shot him in the chest during a deadly pistol fight, and the slug settled in dangerously close to his heart, where no surgeon dared to dig. So the future president simply lived with it, carrying the bullet inside his body for the rest of his life. It occasionally caused him pain and trouble. The man led a nation with a lead souvenir parked beside his heart. 110. Soldiers facing the bone saw were handed a leather strap or a chunk of wood to bite down on, because there was nothing else to dull the agony. As the surgeon began cutting through flesh and bone, The only comfort offered was something to clamp their jaws onto so they would not shatter their own teeth or scream themselves hoarse. That is where biting the bullet comes from. Men gripped that wood and endured pure torment fully awake. It was less medicine and more a test of raw human endurance. 111. The government let states forcibly sterilize people they labeled unfit, and the Supreme Court actually approved it. Under eugenics laws, Americans deemed undesirable were sterilized against their will, robbed of the ability to ever have children. In 1927, the highest court in the land upheld the practice, with a justice coldly declaring that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Thousands of innocent people were permanently altered based on prejudice dressed up as science. It stands as one of the darkest chapters America wrote into its own law books. And there you have it. 111 absolutely unhinged moments from medical history where the cure was almost always worse than the disease. Doctors blew smoke up rear ends, fed kids radioactive oatmeal, and somehow goat testicles became a business plan. The wildest part is that real people lived through every single one of these, wide awake and screaming. So if your jaw hit the floor even once, smash that like button, subscribe to Dumb History for more chaos, and drop a comment telling everyone which fact disturbed you the most. We read every single one. Now go wash your hands because clearly nobody back then did.